But of the thousands of young men who eagerly stepped forward to fight, few were prepared for the horrors that this war would inflict upon them and their homeland.
Although there was this sort of feeling that one Southerner could whip 5 Yankees or 5 Northerners, they had no idea what it would actually be like when war came along, what it would take to sustain the armies in the field, what it would entail as far as losing fathers, sons, and brothers in combat. They just had no clue what a long war was going to be like.
I had my name enrolled with the list of volunteers for service in the Confederate States of America. I am willing to shed the last drop of my blood on the altar of my country, if that could be the means of saving us from Northern treachery.
In the Florida parishes, Camp Moore became the main training ground for Louisiana's soldiers. But fighting off hunger and disease, troops began to worry more about dying in their tents than on the battlefield.
I was astonished by the change. Of the 600 who first arrived, there are now but about 250. Everywhere it's diarrhea, chills, and fever.
Throughout Louisiana, people of every class and color pitched in to help needy soldiers and their families. Before long, however, many at home could no longer help themselves. Immediately after the first shots were fired, President Lincoln ordered the largest blockade ever attempted. Union warships patrolled more than 3,000 miles of coastland in an effort to strangle off Southern commerce, especially at the mouth of the Mississippi River.
Things are daily increasing in price. Coffee is now $1 per pound, and Ma has notified us that we must soon say goodbye to it.
New Orleans, the great economic engine powering the Confederacy, had virtually ground to a halt. By February of 1862, 2,000 families depended on government relief for food. Even more than supplies, however, what New Orleans needed most was soldiers.
The South just did not have enough manpower to defend every point, so you had to have priorities. And in the early days of the war, the main threat was to Tennessee and Virginia, so that's where they were shipping the troops to. There just weren't many men left to defend New Orleans.
It was no military secret that sooner or later the Union would attempt to wrest control of New Orleans from the Confederacy.
From the northern perspective, it was essential to the northern economy. Also militarily for the North, if they can capture the river, it would split the South in two and would lop off the Western Confederacy from the main body of the Confederacy and make it easier to conquer. So the Mississippi River became kind of a focal point for both sides.
Besides its strategic value, New Orleans was also a vital center of cash and supplies for Confederate forces. It was one of the few industrial cities of the South with factories producing weapons, uniforms, and shoes. Rebel leaders believed that the Union would come downriver, attacking from the north, so defenses were concentrated in places like Memphis and Vicksburg.
And while Governor Moore and others in Louisiana were constantly sending out messages to Jefferson Davis begging for men and supplies, Davis felt like the situation there was sufficient to prevent New Orleans from being captured. He was absolutely wrong.
Word reached New Orleans that a fleet of federal warships had been spotted in the Gulf of Mexico. 15,000 Union soldiers were assembling on Tiny Ship Island, just off the coast from Biloxi, and more were on their way. Downriver from New Orleans, the city's defense would depend on two strongholds facing each other from opposite sides of the Mississippi: Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip.
They looked good on paper, but they weren't nearly as strong as they appeared to be. They were impregnable-looking fortresses, big, tall brick walls, about 20 feet high, 10 feet thick, moats around them, had over 100 cannons inside the forts and several hundred men. But as it turned out, the cannons were old and outdated. Some of them had actually been used in the War of 1812. The powder had been sitting there for years and turned out to be very bad, very poor quality. The men, a lot of them didn't want to be there.
The officer charged with the unenviable duty of defending New Orleans was Major General Mansfield Lovell.
He was a Northerner by birth. He really stepped into almost an unwinnable situation. He did a good job in trying to raise troops and gather cannons and things to defend New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, but part of the problem was as quickly as he could raise troops, Jefferson Davis was taking them away to send elsewhere.
General Lovell did what he could to fortify the city's defenses. He bolstered the artillery and strengthened the garrisons. A raft, constructed of cypress trees and 2.5-inch chain cables, was stretched across the river to block the passage of enemy ships between the two forts. On April 18, 1862, 46 federal warships steamed up the Mississippi towards Forts Jackson and St. Philip. Armed with 348 cannons and 21 mortars, it was the largest fleet the United States Navy had ever assembled. In command was the 60-year-old flag officer, David Farragut, a Southerner who had spent much of his life in New Orleans. His friends among the rebels had urged him to defect, but he remained loyal to the United States.
Mind what I tell you. You fellows will catch the devil before you get through with this business.
Farragut was a man of his word. Day and night, the Union fleet rained down thousands of shells on the forts for nearly a week. The thunder of the guns was heard 50 miles away. Amazingly, the forts held. But rather than turn around, Farragut opted for one of the most daring maneuvers of the war. At 2 a.m. on April 24th, he signaled a charge upriver.
He was hoping that they could slip past in the dark without being seen. But it didn't work. They were spotted. There was a huge artillery duel, over 100 cannons in the forts, probably at least that many on the ships, for several hours as the fleet battled its way past the forts.
At one point, Farragut found his own ship ablaze with flames leaping halfway up the main mast. Still, he continued his relentless advance.
He had absolutely no guarantee that he would be able to get past those forts with his vessels. He was taking a real chance.
When daylight came, Farragut's fleet had virtually destroyed Confederate defenses on the river. Of all the ships that had tried to run past the forts, only 2 failed to make it. From there, Farragut and his men cruised upriver toward New Orleans unopposed.
The sugar and cotton have been burned. That is one comfort. And the work of destruction still goes on at the plantations. I shall never forget the long, dreadful night when we sat with our friends and watched the flames from all sorts of valuables as the gunboats were coming up the river.
But even if it could not fight off an attack, New Orleans, the South's treasure house, was determined to deny Farragut his prize. To avoid capture, General Lovell pulled his troops out before the fleet arrived, leaving New Orleans defenseless. On Friday afternoon, April 25th, the Union fleet dropped anchor at the foot of Canal Street. With the river running high that spring, Farragut's ships sat well above the levees. They trained their guns straight down on the city. Resistance was pointless. Confident in his victory, Farragut sent just 2 officers, unarmed, into the city.
They walked abreast, unguarded and alone, looking not right or to left, never frowning, never flinching, while the mob screamed in their ears, shook cocked pistols in their faces, cursed and crowded, gnashed upon them. So through the gates of death, those 2 men walked to the city hall to demand the town's surrender. It was one of the bravest deeds I ever saw done.
Farragut had taken New Orleans, but keeping it would be charged to another man. While the admiral and his fleet continued upriver toward Baton Rouge, the Union Army took possession of the city, led by a general who would come to be called the Beast.